discussion. Without wasting any more time, we'll quickly move on to our next panel that we have currently. And this time we'll be talking about ESG and supply chain, a new lens for sustainable business value creation. Are we ready for that panel? So let Jasmine introduce our esteemed panelists to all of you now.
Thanks, Kaustav. So when I call upon the names, request you to please come on the stage. Our first panelist is Mr. Amit Tandon, Founder and Managing Director, Institutional Investor Advisory Services. Followed by Mr. Indra Guha, Partner, BDO India. We also have Mr. Satish Ramchandani, Co-Founder and CBO, Updapt, an ESG tech company. And to moderate this session, may I please call upon Mr. Hitesh Sethi once again. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please don't stop the cheering.
Can we have a huge round of applause for our panelists here?
Thank you.
So I think the journey for the day has been where we looked at the macro picture. The first panel was about this big elephant called ESG. What does it mean, in the global context, and as part of that, how we are adopting it in India. The second was more internal, within a firm, what do we do, how do we do it, and we did speak briefly about the ecosystem. I think in this panel, we'll explore the supply chain a little bit more. I think we all believe that supply chain is strategic, important, and it leads to competitive advantage. But I'll be fair in saying that it's often the most neglected part when it comes to ESG. We don't really look at the supply chain at all. And so let me just start with that, point. And Amit, ESG and supply chain, that whole relationship and how it is important.
Thanks very much. Thank you for inviting me today to share my views. So when we kind of think about supply chain, while most companies and all of us think that it's a relatively small part of what companies are spewing out, if you look at the data, what your supply chain would do to a company would be 11 times that of what the company discharges on its own. So therefore, it's a fairly significant amount which is there, which in itself speaks about the need for all of us to focus on what is happening on the supply chain. And it becomes very difficult because when most people begin it, they begin by saying, look, what is it that we need to do internally? It's only after they've come to grips or have some understanding with regard to what they're doing, they kind of move to what the supply chain is doing. And partly it's because of the scale, size, and the complexity. The other, just one more comment which I want to leave with you and with all of you in the room is, again, you may have heard this before, Professor Chandrabhanu Bhattacharya has kind of said it, and in that context, the supply chain becomes important. The smaller companies, when you talk about sustainability and stewardship, the smaller companies always think that it's the problem of the larger companies. The larger companies think it's the problem which the government needs to address rather than something which they need to address. And then when you look at the players and the state, the developing countries, India, China, the others think that, look, this problem has been created by the Western world and therefore it's the US and the European countries which have to address it. And therefore there's this whole passing of the buck which is going on. Unfortunately, if you kind of break it up and say, look, this problem is very real, it is here and therefore we need to sort it out, that's when things will start taking a move. And when we kind of speak about it, we are not talking about the large companies, then we are talking about the smaller companies which include people who are there in the supply chain, and it also includes us as individuals and as employees in companies or as citizens where we have to address this issue. So these were the two thoughts. One, the scale of the problem is very large. B, people who are up and down the supply chain do have a decisive impact on the environment and it needs to be addressed. And third is, just because you're small, it does not mean that you can ignore it and say it's someone else's problem. You need to look at what the issue is, what are you doing, and how do you address the challenges in front of you? Back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Very interesting comments. I think from a large company perspective, the immediate link is visible to me, but I think the visibility is also important. We look at auto, for example. I know who my tier 1 supplier is, but I don't know who the tier 2, tier 3 levels are. Similarly, globally, I am J&J, but then in my product, there is a commodity coming. I don't know from which region it's coming because I am buying it from my tier 1. And my tier 1 could be DuPont, for example. So that's the commodity cycle, and then there is the sourcing of parts cycle which happens. And that digitization of the supply chain, the data which is emerging there, and the implementation challenges. Indra, if you have any, illustrations, examples where companies have been solving this, how have they been solving it, anything which are key takeaways from that perspective.
Sure. Thanks, Satish, and thanks DNB for this opportunity. From my side, let me share the experience that we have seen, particularly in engaging with different organizations in this particular area. So what we have seen is the uptake on this sustainable supply chain, the concept, implementation part, that has actually become much more reinforced in the last, say, 7-8 years' time. So earlier it used to be there. The quality, cost, timeliness part was very much there. Organizations tried to integrate ESG in some areas, in some pockets. But the understanding of how to integrate and how to approach the entire supply chain through the tiers, as you mentioned, that was completely a very difficult area. People were very vague about how to approach it altogether. So there, as you rightly mentioned, the awareness about the different tiers of supply chain, that's the biggest challenge. So one of the survey reports that I was actually taking a look at, it was mentioning hardly any of the organizations have visibility on their tier 2, tier 3 level suppliers. They just want to cut it off at the tier 1 level where they want to pass on the liabilities to the tier 1 suppliers itself. But that's not going to be actually serving the purpose. Now, the complete ecosystem is demanding for, as in the earlier panel also, the ecosystem approach was mentioned. So that's something which any business will have to work upon. Without that, it will be very difficult to kind of implement across the supply chain. People may be talking about it, people may be creating frameworks, and people like us maybe kind of create some good framework and put it up in an Excel file or a PPT and pass it on to the organizations. But the moment it comes to implementation across the different tiers, it's going to fall flat. So what we have seen in some of the cases, the linkages between the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers, that mapping part and the awareness among the different groups of suppliers in the different tiers, that varies hugely. I mean, see, it's such a vast difference. The organization faces a challenge over there, how to tackle this animal. How do we group the suppliers into different clusters and we identify what is the issue for each of these clusters. So most of the organizations, what they try to do is they try to kind of go in for a one-size-fits-all kind of a thing. Maybe the same jacket, you use it for all the suppliers across at the time of onboarding or at the time of audits that they conduct periodically. But that doesn't serve the purpose. Unless we analyze the different supplier groups based on we have heard about materiality, we have heard about ESG. So we need to divide the suppliers into different groups and identify what are the material issues for each of these groups.
Right.
And then need to have customized tools for engaging with them and partnering with them to bring them up to a certain level of it. It's just not a checklist that if you comply with this, you are with me, and if you do not comply, then you are not with me, and I'm going to choose someone else.
Right.
So that kind of thing has to go out, and it's very positive as I see. Organizations are also taking that kind of a stand where they want to get into an advisory mode, they want to partner with their supply chain, and they want to kind of bring in a change across the entire, entire value chain, so to say. So not only through maybe advice, but also there are some integrations that are happening across the entire supply chain, backward integrations and all, where organizations are stepping up their performance and getting into the supplier's role also at certain instances. Pandemic had triggered it a little bit, but I would not credit the pandemic completely for the supply chain response. It had started much earlier, and organizations realized that unless I take care of my supply chain, then there would be exposures which will be giving me sudden shocks at certain points of time. So that's I'll leave it over here
Sure.
and maybe come back
Yeah.
later, Hitesh.
No. So when you look at the data part of it, today, let's just look at GST implementation, look at the HSN codes linked to it, look at input credit. I think that data is there, right, which can solve the linkage problem. I think the issue is that who should have that accessible and how the linkages can be made available and useful to the anchors at least, right? Because I think that's the first part of the problem. So what I wanted to bring into the conversation was the use of data and the enablement through technology. Because when, say, in the 1980s, when we started this whole automobile revolution in India, then it was a push, supplier development was, let me go invest in them, train them, skill them. But now we are much more advanced, right? Data is available, technology is there. In your experience, Satish, how does this all come together? Are you seeing some aspects where this has been encouraging or has been useful?
Thanks, Hitesh. And probably I'll begin with adding some more context to what Amit said, to sort of really make it more engaging and make the issue or the topic more real, right? So supply chain, or I would say scope 3 emissions, constitutes about 80% of the total emissions. And within that, I would say supply chain partners typically in a manufacturing setup would be around 60–70%, So the problem is for real. And I'm sure most of us know. The question would be then, how do we really monitor or measure the performance of supply chain partners? Again, given that most of them would be SMEs. So again, there are practical solutions. It's more on the intent. And beyond intent also, regulations are the one which can really push that, right? So the linkages which I'm trying to really, draw is, we have the vendor evaluation process in many companies since years, tier 1, tier 2. And even if you look at tier 1, they constitute 80% of your expense, right? Similarly, they may constitute 70–80% of your emissions. So even out of your 1,000 vendors, you begin with 100 or 200 of them. Believe me, it's not that difficult. From a regulation standpoint, most of the disclosures are mandatory for scope 1, scope 2. Scope 3 is voluntary as of now. But as we have seen now, the new guidelines which SEBI's, it's there in the public domain for consultation, or even the International Standard Board standards, which again suggest that after a year is going to be mandatory, for scope 3. So the moment you see regulations come in, believe me, everything will fall into track. So that's one piece. Second, the financial impact of all the ESG metrics, right? The first panel where Shankar mentioned about, how rating agencies are making it part of the process, right? We had Rupa and, other bankers out there making, again, ESG metrics as part of the core lending processes. The more you see the financial impact of ESG performances, believe me, businesses are here for profit, let's be honest. It's a capitalist language, but that's for real. You'll actually start seeing all the investments, and within 12 to 18 months, you'll see a lot of scope 3 information, a lot of supply chain information there in the public domain. 12 months back, when we were in the market, believe me, we didn't have a lot of interest from Indian counterparts. The moment BRSR became mandatory, we have good amount of clients, whether with us or many of our other partners in consulting or tech solutions. Now, coming back to your specific question around, the data sets for the supply chain, or again, how technology can be an enabler. One, again, as I said, the moment you apply the 80–20 principle from a volume perspective, you attack your top tier 1 suppliers, believe me, you'll cover a major proportion around that. And even, it may sound operational, you have a KYC onboarding process, you have a quarterly or a 6-monthly vendor evaluation process. DNV has the services around evaluating, your supply chain partners. You include 10 ESG metrics, it's as simple as that. And there are digital solutions, which helps small to medium enterprises or even large enterprises, handful of off-the-shelf products, at very low cost, where you can actually measure your carbon footprint accounting.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think, if you make it part of your regular reporting, it's easier, but then let's look at the landscape, right? If you look at the waterfall, majority of these enterprises are micro enterprises. When you look at the country, and they are suppliers in somebody's ecosystem, and I'll bring in the cost point, which we covered, and from an burden of running initiatives. Say, for example, if I'm looking at environmental discharges, and for me to have effluent treatment implemented in a facility, and I'm a tier 3, auto component manufacturer based out of Faridabad, right? Now, all good, I understand, that there's a cost to the society at large, environmental, but fundamentally today that tier 3 exists because he's at the cheapest and lowest cost for a model which is maybe at its last legs in the Indian market. If that cost burden goes up, is the customer willing to pay? Who's willing to bear that? And that's something which operationally comes to their mind, and I'll suggest a direction also in maybe, and Amit, maybe you can come in. Institutionally, when we say that there are various stakeholders, and when we look at, many of these suppliers being MSMEs, the institutional enablement, where there is somebody at the state government level who's driving, for a common cluster, certain interventions, along with the support of multilateral agencies, and somebody who's monitoring them and driving them, isn't that something which would enable this as, a solution which becomes more scalable?
At the end of the day, the push needs to come from various different entities. So as you said, maybe there is someone at the state government who says this is the cluster and therefore we will do something for the cluster development. So if you look at what SIDBI is doing, there is a great deal of focus which they bring to the cluster development programs, and whether it is to say that, look, there's going to be a common effluent treatment, or they say there's going to be common, put up some green, something for green energy, be it wind or solar or whatever it is. There is the sole attempt to do it at a cluster level. The second is picking up from what Satish said, which is that there has to be a regulatory push.
Right.
Now that regulatory push is again easier for the larger companies, and it comes in two forms. One is in terms of what you report, and the second is in terms of standards. We can debate whether it's right, wrong, how is it being monitored, how is the data being produced, but nonetheless, I'm a great believer that, look, unless there is the regulatory push, things are going to be, I won't say will not happen, but the time taken is going to be significantly longer. So the moment there is a push, it's going to happen. I think the third thing which we need to think about it is that when companies approach this whole thing, it's what is the attitude which the CEO has. Are they seeing them as merely suppliers, or are they seeing a lot of the people who are there up and down the supply chain, whether tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, as extensions of what the company is doing? So if they see them as partners and engage with them and dialogue with them and say that, look, these are what our requirements are, this is how things are going to change 6 months, 1 year, 3 years down the line, which is coming out of our reporting, or what our competitors are doing, or what we are seeing global trends, that is going to move the needle much, much more. When we keep talking about ESG, etc., and just touching upon the point you alluded to, the attempt, whether it is the regulator or whether it is a larger entity, has to be to communicate to the supplier in this instance that what is your benefit. And you can always say it's a risk that if you don't do it, I'm not going to kind of buy your product, etc. But it's going to be much, much more effective if you say that, look, you're going to make much more money over the longer term if you're going to be doing it. So that is the conversation which needs to take place, that you do this, we are going to buy more, this is beneficial for the environment, maybe you get better products. So it has to be driven by how does it benefit you, how does it profit you, and why is it that you need to do it, then that whole will desire to make this change will happen internally rather than something which is pushed. In this context, we keep looking at companies who do CSR. And our experience is that where it is most effective, the spends on CSR and the company is kind of doing something which kind of resonates with everyone is there, where it kind of ties in with the company's business strategy. Otherwise, you can say that, okay, I'm going to, plant trees, maybe someone's interested, someone's not, maybe the CEO is interested, CEO is not. And let me kind of illustrate that with an example. So if you look at one of the many programs which Maruti has, is to say that, look, we are going to train people in rural India to become drivers. Now, you can kind of draw that there's a fairly straight correlation between, the number of trained drivers and, well, not a straight correlation, but you can expect that there is going to be a linkage between the number of drivers and the number of cars they will be able to sell. Similarly, there are some IT companies who kind of say that, okay, we are going to say differently disabled, train them on software skills. And that is a set of people who are going to be available to them. So I come back to it. If you're able to tie in the benefits of adopting ESG to the company's business prospects, you'll find it's going to happen quicker and faster. If you don't do it, people will do it for regulations. If regulations are not there, they're not seeing the benefits, they'll say, okay, we're going to do it in the fullness of time. It's a longish answer. But
no, absolutely.
If I can just add, I'll take that specific example of that Faridabad guy, who's a tier 1 vendor. Tier 1, tier 2, we covered that, they'll form 80% of the emissions of a large corporate, so they'll automatically get covered. Revenue could be 100 crore, 200 crore. But this tier 1 guy is a 20, 30 crore guy, or maybe a 5 crore revenue guy, So beyond compliance is regulation, as maybe adding to what Amit said, there needs to be a P&L benefit. Okay, and business exists for profits. The only thing is they need to see profits, over the years and not in a couple of years, right? So from a governance standpoint, which was a point, so the moment there are fundamental shifts in the way you run the planet or the country and hence the business, right? For example, the moment electric vehicles become cheaper than petrol and diesel vehicles, we all will buy EVs, right? The moment you have all these sustainable products will become cheaper, then the non-sustainable product will automatically start buying. So that's where the government can actually significantly come in, right? We saw petrol was probably 30-40% more than diesel. Now it's almost the same price. There was a government push towards that, right? So these are some of the roles government can actually take. Another two elements on, the Faridabad example again, you have to begin small. Start with 5 KPIs. That's where the corporates can come in, right? The 20-30% of their suppliers ask for 5 KPIs, 3 or 4, not 10, 20, 100. Ask for 1 diversity, 2 environment, 1 governance. Fair enough. Start small.
Yeah, no, I agree with Amit in the involvement of various stakeholders in the role. It doesn't get done if it's not part of my business strategy linked very clearly and has a demonstrable benefit at the end of it. Because end of the day, many of these initiatives are not immediate, they're medium to long term, the benefit accrues. And I think the regulation helps, it helps expedite it. In that context, let me look at it differently. I'll pick up from the EV example, and this is the other challenge from the supply chain perspective. Sustainability is one, but the other is the skill migration, so I would say the skill gap which will exist because the new technology is getting adapted under the ESG canvas. So we look at EV, for example, or when you look at renewable energy, today there are power plants which are existing, there are people who are deployed, and there is a supplier ecosystem which is supporting them. Likewise, on the auto component, somebody is doing work on the internal combustion engines, somebody is looking at, small parts, larger parts. When at a country level, you are migrating and telling them that this is it, the other part is that there will be a skill deficit because employment generation is a key objective. So any views, Indra,
Just wanted to add, and Amit has already touched upon that. So this process is already on the way. So when we see the BRSR coming in And the first three principles of BRS are actually touching upon the supply chain agenda quite strongly. So what we envisage is that slowly it's going to mature over a period of time, and there are going to be very definitive guidelines on mapping the supply chain footprint. And after that, possibly we'll be getting an ecosystem, maybe with facilitation from the government, where businesses would be having a lot of options which are leading towards more of sustainable sourcing, as you were hinting at. So that's something which we can definitely look up to. Although globally the guidelines are already quite mature, and globally what we have seen with some of the organizations that we have worked with, they have already adopted some of the very, very mature guidelines from SEDEX Meta, which purely talks about the ethical trade initiatives. It talks about, some of the organizations have already adopted the UNGC Sustainable Supply Chain Guidelines, and they are trying to kind of align them very strongly. They are going in for traceability studies across different geographies. But I think in India, it's quite a long way to go. I mean, see, we have just started it off. Supply chain is getting mapped, the footprint is getting mapped, and the BRSR and the norms that are coming in, they are also pushing the industry, the business towards that. But maybe in another 3 to 5 years' time, we can expect some very specific guidelines around managing the supply chain, and which will be leading towards a database for businesses to choose from. So finally, the creation of an ecosystem that we are talking about, that's going to be facilitated by all these guidelines that are going to come up and the strictures that are going to come up.
But at the same time, at an industry level today, and many countries do that, say that my value chain is very clear, I've mapped my value chain, and at the decision making, say let's say at the Niti Aayog Planning Commission level, I know how the value transmission is happening. This is my roadmap 20 years hence, keeping ESG and say sustainability and competitiveness in mind. And from a resource skill perspective, then this is the journey which we will have to make. I think regulation may help you adapt, but it will impact different companies at different level differently. And is there merit in looking the whole skill problem, which even currently we have, but in this changing technology environment, keeping sustainability in mind.
It is just to add, see, that's something which we are seeing when we are actually engaging with the supply chain as well with the organizations, the businesses. We are seeing that there is a very, very basic skill gap. They know about their job, their production, and all that stuff. But when it comes to maybe getting into ESG stuff, developing some kind of a system by means of which they'll be able to practice some of the good practices. It's not only about compliance. Compliance is taken for granted that it's going to be there on the ground. But we are expecting much more initiatives at the supplier end when it comes to maybe reducing carbon footprint, or maybe looking at some of the climate risk exposures. Now we have these guidelines on task force on climate related financial disclosures. So many of the organizations, they are trying to map the entire supply chain, try to find out what is the exposure of their supply chain from the climate risk point of view. So it's very difficult to kind of reach out to the suppliers and communicate to them all these kind of risk exposures that they're having. So it's still remaining, restricted to some of the big businesses, the large conglomerates who are actually planning it, but they're not being able to percolate it across the supply chain.
Right.
Because of this.
And just on this point, SEBI has recommended, this, top 250 companies, the supplier side disclosure.
So let me kind of, before I jump into that, I just want to make a broader point, and in sense it's linked to skills and so on and so forth. Maybe less with the supply chain, but I think it's very important for all of us here in the room to understand it. So I'm a part of the SEBI ESG committee, and part of the discussions has been that, look, when we look at ESG, again, like a lot of things which is there, it's not just blindly copying what is there in the US or the Europe, but kind of have a very Indian specific ESG. Now this is, in one sense it's very difficult to think about it, but the approach which has been taken is that, look, G is something which is there in every, we've got fairly long-standing regulations around what G needs to cover and what the factors are, and it's kind of reasonably well understood by companies. Again, E is science-led. So if you're looking at discharge, effluent discharge, water treatment, so on and so forth. Again, a lot of it is based on science, but therefore the focus from an India-specific ESG has to be on the S aspect, which is how we can make or distinguish ourselves from what ESG is in India versus what it is in a lot of other countries. So we already saw there was a beginning which was made when the focus was on CSR. Now the view is that, look, can we look at S, and therefore when we look at, when you spoke about employment, it has to be an area of focus. When you look at gender, it has to be an area of focus, and therefore get the companies to make disclosures around it and get companies to kind of have assurance around it. And one of the steps which SEBI said is that, look, maybe not everything which is in the BRSR, but they've kind of initially identified, I think, 12 or 14. And this is a part of the discussion paper which was there in the third week of February, saying that there are about 12 or 15 factors around which they would welcome assurance around it. And in that context, again, when they looked at the document, it was in three parts. One is, what is it that companies are expected to do? And that is largely spelt out by what is stipulated by the BRSR. The second is, what are investors expected to do? And this is, again, to prevent some amount of greenwashing, which the investors, at least not here, but globally have done, because globally it's a fairly large $7 trillion or so is, tracking ESG. In India, the number is just over $1 billion. So the scale of the problem is not really there, as you've seen. But nonetheless, they felt it's important. The third is that you have the ESG rating provider. So in the earlier session, there was a reference to Sustainalytics, etc. So the question asked is that, look, once you're rating entities, should you include what the suppliers are, start looking at suppliers and where you are on that aspect of the evaluation? Our answer, of course, is, and again, what I had said and what again was said by Satish, that given the fact that scope 3 will amount to about 70 to 80% of the emissions, it's important to focus on it. So while SEBI might give the rating providers some leeway to say that, look, you don't have to do it on day one, or maybe prioritize it. And this is coming from the fact that, the data quality from companies themselves is a little bit iffy at this stage. So give the market some time to adjust to it, get hold of some more robust data, get hold of data which has some greater credibility, and you can trust it, and then use it as a way of evaluating companies on their ESG. But so I thought it's important to share how SEBI is thinking about ESG on the whole, rather than just looking at it from a very narrow supplier's point of view.
Sure. No, I think very clearly the supply chain aspect requires a more comprehensive view, like you rightly said, integrated to the business model. But there are various stakeholders which have to drive that initiative. Like Satish said, simple things, we can start capturing. We already have a process. We can start with tier 1, and the tier 1 can then go on to tier 2. The regulation will help, because when they push it down for larger enterprises, it will cover a larger ecosystem. And the lending side enablement also, focused on ESG is happening, and on top of that, the other feedback which I heard was that global frameworks are fine, but our context and environment is very different, and we need to see it in that lens. And largely, I also feel like Maruti did and has been doing, that kind of involvement in the supplier development enables you to drive that benefit and demonstrate that benefit to them. Sure. So I'll just quickly take a pause here, open it up. If there are any questions, please feel free.
Hello and good afternoon. I would just like to thank the panel and the chair for their valuable time and insights. My name is Shalvi, and I work in ESG ratings of corporates with institutional shareholder services. My question, rather request, is to Mr. Amit Tandon. So you briefly spoke about the SIDBI Cluster Development Program. Could you please shed some more light on it and how they tackle sustainability or what they can be doing about it?
I think what SIDBI is trying to do is to recognize the fact that, look, there are a lot of small companies, and therefore if it comes to them individually, they may not be able to make significant capital investments on some of it what matters for ESG. So their idea is that, let's say, they identify a plot of land which is, or somewhere where there is an industrial park, which is, 25 acres, 50 acres, or whatever it is. And therefore, they kind of work with the companies or the units which are in that area to develop something which is a shared facility. Now, the idea is that, as I mentioned, if it is a solar power project, maybe an individual company might find it challenging. But if you were to do it on scale, you find that there are some economies which also kick in at that time, and therefore the per unit cost tends to come down. So that is one example. The second is when you kind of do it for effluent discharge. Now, for individual companies to kind of set up a large plant is going to be very difficult, or even a small plant. And they might kind of do it the old-fashioned way, which is, tie it up in a plastic bag and throw it somewhere. But if they know that this facility is available at a reasonable cost, then they're going to be using the facility, and it's going to be better for everyone concerned. And then they can actually talk about the fact that, their discharge levels and so on and so forth, or emission levels, whatever they are doing, are off. Measure it and say what the data points are. So what SIDBI is doing is they've run about 2 or 3 pilots, if I'm not mistaken. It could be more. That is their philosophy and thinking behind what they're doing at this stage.
Thank you.
Yeah. My question to Mr. Amit. The CSR ambit, the 5 crore company with a net profit of 5 crore come to CSR ambit. 5 crore company is a MSME sector. Why can't the same applicable for ESG and EPR? Now EPR is for above 50 ton, which is now going to extend it to other than plastic. But ESG is also for the listed. Why can't it for the MSME sector? I mean, it could be CSR common reporting, or it could be CSR rules can be modified.
I'm not sure I've understood the question.
The question is, for CSR, ESG is also one of the type of, is a compliance, but CSR, right? It is part of CSR. 5 crore company with a net profit of 5 crores coming to CSR ambit, which means the MSME sector is coming into the ambit of CSR. Why can't for the ESG sector, the MSME sector come into this ambit, and same thing for EPR. EPR, of course, not for this section. I'm surprised why this is why it is ESG only for the listed entity, why not for MSME sector?
Look, it's very difficult. I mean, when it came in, most people have seen it as an additional tax.
Yeah.
And if you were to look at the regulations, I mean, forget the fact it began as a comply or explain, and now it's kind of become, people are expected to adhere to it. But the fact is that even there are carve-outs for companies who don't make profits. And then if you kind of go back and look at the MSME sector, you'll find that, the profit levels are not there. They may not be meaningful. Now, if, you're talking about companies of 5 crore, 10 crores, they're making minuscule profits, and then you're looking at a 2% there. It's not going to be a meaningful number. But having said so, if you kind of, think about it slightly differently and look at it from a different perspective, I think as a society, we all are fairly, there is a lot of charity which we do as a society. So forget what a corporate is supposed to do as a part of the CSR, which is forced upon it. But if you look at it, whether it is for temples, whether it is other ways where we are doing it, I think we've been doing, and it's not something which is new. We've been doing it from times immemorial. So, just look closer home. If you look at the Mumbai Zoo, the zoo was funded by charity. It's not that, the municipal corporation said that we need a zoo, etc., etc. So you just go back. You go to the smaller, you go to the districts and smaller towns, you'll find that there are a lot of degree colleges, at least that's what we call them, up north. I don't know what the word is here. And a lot of the degree colleges are funded by families and family trusts, etc., etc. So companies and individuals have been doing a lot for society Government has kind of put a sheen and tried to put a structure around it, which has its pluses and it has its drawbacks. But let's kind of, and I'm sure the way these things work is you begin with the larger companies and slowly it percolates down to the smaller ones. But that's where it is. So I would say there's enough happening over a period of time. I do expect it will go down. Is this the right time to push it to everyone or not? I'm not, I don't really have a clear
If I can just add, I think fundamentally you're drawing the point that the way you have for CSR, why not for ESG? So I think 12 months back we have seen the action for 1,000 listed companies. You'll have all 3,000-4,000 listed companies gradually being covered. You'll have to be a preferred fund for partner and do business with corporates. You'll have your supply chain partners also doing it. You'll have your bankers asking, the loans which they give, whether to unlisted entities also, they'll also be covered in the net. So you'll see that action in next 2 to 4 years.
Yeah.
That was the question. This is the perfect answer.
Yeah, yes, sure. Yeah, just last one question, please.
Yeah, Anil here again from GR. The supply chains we all know are very important for all mega complexes, mega big businesses. With respect to manufacturing, infrastructure and construction. What is the, how are supply chains being upgraded, and being brought on par so that they provide the necessary goods, necessary services, necessary products, and the processes down the line. It's not just a question of the final product, but the processes down the line from the supply chains that bring in raw materials and stuff. How are those going to be upgraded in the next? It can't just happen that we make a regulation and it will happen. There has to be upgradation. There has to be transfer of know-how from the biggies to the small ones, especially because I think it's 65% of those supply chain are MSME. So they don't have the money, they don't have the finances to try to upgrade themselves to that level. And it has to, like you said, percolate. But unfortunately, the percolation and the filtration at the end is so small that we still find MSME is struggling. And we have to compete in a world market now. And this ESG, especially with respect to climate change and more importantly, sustainability, that is the key factor. So how is supply chain of MSMEs going to come to pass so that the products of corporates, mega complexes remain world standard? Thank you.
So if I may, and I'll come to you, Indra.
Quickly, I heard the question and the somewhat answer was also there in your question. So from the biggies to the smallies, that's something which is already happening. There may be a long way to go in India. It's a long way. It's accepted. I think in this room we don't have a doubt that there's a lot of mileage to be covered. But it has started. The larger organizations are engaging, and some of the one of the auto sector giants in India, they are trying to reach up to the tier 4 level, particularly from the carbon footprint point of view, the scope 3 emissions point of view. They are trying to map up to the tier 4 in order to engage with them and uplift their practices so that they can actually advise them, engage with them and bring in the change that they want to see across their entire supply chain. So it's not going to be very quick, but it's there.
Yeah, and it's been happening actually. It didn't require ESG to come in for the last 10 years, actually more. Cluster development has been a focus, that has been, I think it started 2005, 2006. When we're saying cluster development, it addresses credit gap, technology upgradation, it addresses skill gap. There are also schemes which the Ministry of MSME has been running, which is on clusters and Lean Six Sigma and process excellence, which is very much there. Today, in the last 5 years, interestingly, there's so many startups which are trying to digitize, and they're successful actually, on digitizing this whole contract manufacturing ecosystem. So they're saying that, okay, do they need process excellence? Do they need an ERP? Do they need a production planning system? Because the large anchor needs visibility, and that implementation is happening. Now, once this regulation comes in, these pieces are already working. I think many of this will get streamlined. We actually did, interesting, 2012, 2013, the Prime Minister's office had a focus which it was driving on export competitiveness of MSMEs, and towards that, a lot of work which is being done now, is feedback which has originated from there. So these are all things which are actually set in motion. We are a large country, with so many enterprises. I think the question we should ask is that, when will we reach that coconut vendor, at the, corner? I think that's some further distance. But for micro, small manufacturing firms, there are a lot of initiatives which are already ongoing.
Just to add to my question, I was 27th February this year. I was in Jamnagar at a very big organization where they are struggling to find vendors, struggling to train vendors because there's no awareness, and they are struggling. They are not able to get vendors to cater to their mega shift that they are making from RNP to chemicals, which is going to happen in the next 6 years to 7 years. And that's a very short time. And to say, to think as a nation, we are a very big country, that's an advantage, not a disadvantage. So if we move with alacrity and speed, I think implementation is the key. And we are not implementing, there's a lot of talk, there's a lot of statistics, and there's a lot of data, but you can't see it on the ground. The visibility is not there. And the MSME is still, in terms of supply chain, it is very weak. If you think of boomeranging in manufacturing, if we don't have a resilient MSME that is trained and in place, we are going to be in big problem in 7 years. That's what I learned when I was there at that organization. Thank you.
Sure, yeah. So I'll just, sure.
See, actually, in India, we have a double standard. If I talk about the pharma industry, it's already implemented. Everything is implemented up to supplier end. So far as we talk about the exports, we follow everything. Whether it is a small company or big company, they have to do it because it is a regulatory requirement of the country.
Right.
And when we talk about the domestic, we don't follow that. So these are the basic problem of the implementation and regulatory body, how they are handling. So these are the major obstacles are also there, that government is not putting certain norms. If it is a compulsion, people follow that. It's already there.
Yeah, sir, so it's a cycle. Actually, somebody has to break it. Today, say, for example, I'm exporting cars, I'm zinc coating them, but I'm not doing it in India.
Yes.
Largely, if you ask the OEM, they say because the consumer doesn't pay.
Yes.
They're not aware, it's under the car. If, rust sets in.
I would like to say that, better quality pays better price. Even in India also, if you do give better quality, people give you better price.
And you've seen that, sir. That transmission is already happening.
Yes.
So
it is that.
So I think it's, for us, there are complexities. We have firms at different levels.
Yes.
And when we look at implementation, we think only our firm, we don't collaborate. Say, for example, as DNB, we have so much data available.
Yes.
Right? And I'm looking at alternate suppliers. Then that is something which I can enable.
Yes.
But then larger firms, are they aware? Do they take that support? Likewise on ESG data, we have to build that ecosystem. I think gradually it was much slower earlier. Now it's much faster.
Now it is already accepted. But so far as ESG is concerned, even in pharma, we consider even as, labor. Also, we see that, that it should not be child labor. This is a part of vendor qualification. And even foreign bodies also, when they come, they audit supplier, and also they see that, what are the environment things are there, what are the labors are there. All these parts are checked. So it is taken care of ESG, everything.
Sure.
But it is always happening at regulated market, not for the India market.
Yeah, sure.
So,
I agree. Yeah.
So this is the problem, basically.
No, but there's been quite a progress in last 12 months. The pace is in India. Even if you look at infrastructure policies.
Yes.
Okay, you'll start using less of your private vehicles and more of public transport, right? Again, it'll have eventually an ESG impact. And countries have pledges 2050 net zero. So you'll see more of that coming, in coming years.
We have got logistic policy. I was a part of involved in logistic policy also. We had a lot of deliberation for 5 years and then we published that. So government is now, I would say, forefront. Earlier, industry used to initiate that. Now government is initiating. That is the good point of.
Yeah, absolutely, sir. The framework is in place. When we say Gati Shakti, saying cost of logistics should come down, all of that is there in place. I think the states have to, do that last mile. And many of these aspects are ongoing. I think we looked at the pace growing. I'm sorry, I've run out of time and I don't want you guys to be held because of me from lunch.
I would like to just add that, I feel that, we should have born in this era rather than, 65, 60, 70 years before.
Yeah.
See, that much our government is taking care and now we are growing, developing actually in real sense. Actually.
Yes, sir. And our goal should be that 30 years hence our children are making the same statement that,
Yes.
I am born in this era, this is a good era, I
Yes,
should have been born. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you, dear panelists, and a lovely audience who have been interactive all through. That was an amazing session. It's good to have such brainstorming sessions. Gives you a lot of new ideas and ways to be better at doing your business. Isn't it, everyone? We need a cheer. Now I would request Mr. Sethi to hand over the tree certificate to our esteemed panelist, on whose behalf we have planted trees.
Go. You give it to him there only.
Thank you, everyone.